All right, to get started on intermediate macro, I'll take a little time just to say what the class is about. Uh, Now they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, so let's look at some pictures to start. See if you recognize this, and it's related to this. And this, of course, is from the Great Depression, back in the 30s. This is people lined up for a soup kitchen. There's similar lines like this for people that were going to apply for a job. And this one, these are called Hoovervilles. And there were little encampments for that unemployed people built outside of big manufacturing centers, places like Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, New York, where a bunch of manufacturing, an enormous number of manufacturing workers were thrown out of a job, and they built these encampments close by to both just get by and try to have a place to live, but also let the factory owners and politicians know that they were there and ready to go back to work, and but ready to take matters into their own hands if they really had to. So both of these are examples of the economy really going wrong. And in fact, this is the first time the words things like macroeconomy or macroeconomics or recession, even entered people's minds, outside of the profession, and people got this idea that there was this thing called the economy, and it could get sick, and there could be problems with it. Here's another example of things going wrong. See if you know what country this is from. And this one is related to this one. I think this picture is a little more famous. You might recognize it from Germany in the early 20s. This is kids playing with Weimar marks, Deutschmarks, and just nobody really caring about it because they weren't really worth that much. So just quick short history that I'm sure a lot of after World War I, Germany loses, and the Treaty of Versailles puts really punitive measures on Germany, and one of them is they have to pay reparations in gold. And so their economy, their government budget takes a huge hit, and they respond by printing lots of money to pay for government services. And the result was big hyperinflation, well over 100% inflation. So, we think, inflation, depending on the number you look at, we have, somewhere between, 5 and 8% at the most. And a lot of people are losing their minds about it. But this is that's nothing compared to this. This is 100, 200, 300% inflation, which means prices doubling in a matter of weeks. 2 or 3 weeks, all prices roughly doubling. And this one here, this is from Zimbabwe. In a way, a similar story. Robert Mugabe was the leader, essentially dictator of Zimbabwe for decades, and was not a great manager of the economy. One measure of his corruption is he won the national lottery 4 times while he was president, which is pretty. So he's maybe very fortunate or very corrupt. So anyway, this is the Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. They went through a similar period where the Zim dollar they had a hyperinflation, and the Zimbabwe dollars lost an enormous amount of money, as evidenced here. So another example of the economy going really terribly wrong. So, that's, one good reason to study macroeconomics is to understand when this happens and what can lead to it. And fortunately, we haven't experienced anything like this in our lifetimes. So some of the events that, these are extreme cases. So what do we want to explain? Well, of course, in the news recently, we had our big recession from COVID, and the recovery's been messy, to say the least. So, in some ways, the COVID recession was pretty simple. It was pretty obvious what was going on. There was a pandemic. The recovery has been messy, though. Some combination of government mistakes and supply chain issues have given us this actually economy that's running very hot. The unemployment rate is very low, but we do have inflation higher than what we've had for quite some time. The Great Recession, that's the recession from 2008, 2009, post housing crisis. And the associated financial crisis with that. In some ways, for macroeconomics, this is more important because there's some features to this that really are unusual. Of course, a pandemic is unusual, but it's pretty straightforward what's happening. But this was, some combination of a financial market, housing market meltdown gave us the recession, and there's some of the policy responses were really unique. So that's something we really will want to give a lot of time, and maybe even more time than the COVID recession. The lost decade, some of you might know what country that refers to. That's Japan. Now, not many people remember, but, back in the 80s, people talked about Japan taking over the world. Kind of the way they talk about China now, that some people think, China is eventually going to be the dominant player, economically speaking, and, possibly politically and militarily too. That's probably a long way off, but that's at least the topic of conversation today. But back in the 80s, it was Japan. Japan had a big economic boom, but then they had their own real estate crisis, more in commercial real estate in the early 90s. And since then, they've kind of been muddling along. The last few years have been better, but nothing terrible happened, but they've been in this state of very kind of sluggish growth, very low inflation, low interest rates, and debt that's really just been expanding and expanding. So that's certainly something else we'll need to discuss. And also, there's some elements of some parallels with what the United States looked like coming out of the Great Recession. And so that's, one question is whether can the Japan experience inform, our more recent experience. Over in Europe, there's the euro, and continued concern about whether the European Monetary Union can stay together. And of course, Brexit, the UK was, I should say Great Britain was never part of the monetary union, but they were part of the EU, the European Union, which is more about stimulating trade between countries. And of course, Great Britain has stepped out of that. And so far, the results haven't been great. And now, as far as the euro goes, of course, in the headlines, Greece is the big name that people talk about as, possibly having to leave the euro, and because of their problems with debt. So those are two European issues. Besides Greece, Italy and Spain are also, in that boat, in a similar boat. The problems aren't as severe, but those are bigger countries. So if they had to leave the euro, it would be a much bigger deal. In the developing world, developing in quotes, emerging markets is the more modern term to use. But of course, China and India they're not, fully, they haven't risen fully to the level of what they call the G20 countries, the Western European, United States, Japan levels of output and wealth. But they have made a big move forward in the last 20 years. And that's a big deal because those two countries, those are, a huge chunk of the population of the world. So as the economy goes there, the, ripples are felt around the world. And like I said, some people look to China as the next dominant power. Then there's sub-Saharan Africa, which has been actually one of the poorest areas, and is maybe has shown some signs of growth lately, but that really varies among countries. So that's an example of where the the benefits of market economies and being part of the global economy haven't fully reached yet. So, to be more specific, what is macro about? Well, the difference between macro and micro. Micro is all about individual decisions, and that might be consumer decisions, consumers deciding what to buy, responding to some change in taxes, firm decisions, how do firms decide how much stuff to make, what goes into their, how do they decide what to, if they want to innovate, what goes into that. But a macroeconomist, all those things are important, but we have to put it all together to talk about the whole economy, at least a national economy. And if you're more in the international world, then you're combining that with, talking about multiple countries at once. So the big variables that we try to explain are GDP, and that's just roughly how much stuff is produced, loosely speaking, goods and services. I'll get very specific about these shortly, but just to say what the class is about, GDP, the amount of stuff produced, inflation, everybody knows what's going on with prices, although how you measure that is a non-trivial issue. There's more than one way to do it. And unemployment, usually the unemployment rate is the headline number there. So we want to know what goes into these things. Why do they go up? Why do they go down? What should we expect from them? What are some of the factors that can cause them to do something unexpected? Now, of course, there's all kinds of other variables: interest rates, deficits, debt, exchange rates, and so on and so on. There's a long, long, long list of macro-related variables, and those are important too, and they'll help us to understand what's behind these big three. But the big three that's our ultimate goal, is to explain those things. And then once we can explain why those variables do what they do and what they have to do with each other, does inflation and GDP move together? Does GDP and unemployment move together, or the opposite direction? Things like that. So once we can explain that, then we can move on and talk about policy. What can the government do? And once we know what the government's options are, then what should they do? So then we have to take a stand on what's good and what's bad, and what's important. And so then we're doing normative analysis, if you want to break out the philosophy words. If you're just trying to explain what is happening, that's positive analysis. So, and I bring up those words because I think it's important to do the positive analysis first, just to figure out how do these things relate to each other. Um, just explain what is happening before we decide what the government should be doing about it, what the government should be doing to influence those things. So to do that, we'll slowly build a model. Now, a model, that's a word that gets tossed around a lot. A model just means any way to explain these things. And it could be done with words. It could be done with graphs. We'll do a lot of that. It could be done with equations, and we'll do some of that. Loosely, the way we'll go about this is to go short run to long run. So short run stuff is that's the stuff you hear about in the news. What's going to happen with inflation in the next 3 months or 6 months. What's the Fed going to do about it? What's happening with unemployment? So, this is the kind of stuff that dominates the news. What's going to happen to the economy? What's the government going to do about it? But of course, that's not, and that's important, but not necessarily more important than this other stuff, the long run stuff. Why? GDP in this country has been growing steadily for over a century. Why does that happen? What is the growth rate? And why is it that? Why do some countries grow and some countries don't? And then if there's to connect these two, the short run and the long run, this is all about what's changing. But this, when I say the GDP has been growing, that means there's some trend that we seem to be always coming back to. So that's another big goal here, and maybe one of the hardest things in macro is to connect the short run and the long run, and to have an explanation for, given all the stuff that's happening in the short run, with, inflation's going up, inflation's going down, unemployment, what's the Fed doing? We still seem to come back to this long run trend. And how does that happen? What's behind that? So that's why we separate out the medium run here. And then the long run is also a place where macro intersects with what's called development economics, which is the story of, why are some countries so much richer than others? How does it happen that some countries go from being poor to rich? And there's some intersection there. So we'll have some things to say about that.